When we think about history, we often imagine it as distant, primitive, and flawed. We picture people who didn't know better, people who lacked modern knowledge, people who lived in a world before science, before ethics, before reason. It is comforting to believe that, because it creates distance. It allows us to say, they were wrong, but we are different. Yet history tells a far more unsettling story. Most of the things we now describe as cruel, absurd, or horrifying were not seen that way at the time. They were not controversial, they were not debated, they were not hidden, they were normal, so normal that people rarely questioned them. That is what makes them disturbing, not the violence itself, not the suffering, but the silence. This video is not about the strangest events in history. It is about the most ordinary ones, things that existed openly, things people accepted without hesitation, things parents taught their children, things governments regulated, things institutions defended, all because society agreed they were just the way things were. The word normal is dangerous. It doesn't mean good, it doesn't mean moral, it doesn't mean right, it simply means familiar. And familiarity has a way of dulling our sense of judgment. In the past, pain was familiar, so it was accepted. Death was familiar, so it was expected. Inequality was familiar, so it was justified. Children's suffering was familiar, so it was ignored, and none of this required evil intentions. Most people were not monsters. They were neighbors, parents, teachers, doctors, people trying to survive within the limits of their time. That is the uncomfortable truth. History was not shaped only by villains. It was shaped by ordinary people doing ordinary things, within a system that defined cruelty as routine. When we look back, we often ask, how could they allow this? But a better question might be, what would we allow if everyone around us told us it was normal? Because the people of the past did not wake up each morning intending to be cruel. They woke up intending to live their lives. And life, as it was structured, demanded acceptance. This is why history feels so strange when viewed through modern eyes. Not because people were different, but because their standards were. Every era has its own blind spots, things so deeply embedded in daily life that questioning them feels unnecessary, even dangerous. Those blind spots are what this video explores. Not to judge the past, but to understand it, and perhaps to reflect on ourselves. As you listen, you may find yourself reacting emotionally. Shock, discomfort, disbelief. That reaction is natural, but it is also a privilege of hindsight. The people who lived these realities did not have the luxury of perspective. They had survival, they had tradition, they had authority, and authority is powerful. When institutions declare something acceptable, individuals rarely resist. When laws protect certain practices, morality adapts. When everyone around you accepts something, questioning it feels unnatural. This is how the extraordinary becomes ordinary. And once something becomes ordinary, it becomes invisible. Consider this. For much of history, children were not seen as fragile or innocent. They were seen as incomplete, replaceable. Pain was not something to be avoided. It was something to be endured. Death was not a tragedy, it was a statistic. Violence was not hidden, it was entertainment. And none of this happened in secret. It happened in public squares, in schools, in hospitals, in homes, with witnesses, with approval, with applause. The past was not lacking empathy. It was shaped by necessity, scarcity, and belief. Belief that suffering built character. Belief that hierarchy was natural. Belief that certain lives mattered more than others. Belief that questioning the system was pointless. These beliefs were not fringe ideas, they were mainstream. And because they were mainstream, they were rarely examined. This video is structured as a journey through those beliefs. Each story will explore something that once felt normal, even reasonable, but now feels deeply wrong, not because we are smarter, but because standards change, Morality evolves, and progress, when it happens, rewrites memory. We tend to forget that the present is built on accepted practices of the past. Practices we now condemn, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. If the past had blind spots, what are ours? This is not a video meant to make you feel superior to history. It is meant to unsettle you, to make you pause, to remind you that normal is not permanent, that it shifts with time, culture, and power, and that the most dangerous ideas are often the ones no one questions. As we move forward, you will hear about pain, death, inequality, and belief, not as isolated horrors, but as routines, systems, expectations, things people plan their lives around. The goal is not to shock you with extremes, but to show you how ordinary those extremes once were. Because history does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes, and the past is never as distant as we like to believe. So as you listen, don't ask only, how could they live like that? Ask something harder. What would I accept if I had been there? And perhaps even harder. What am I accepting now simply because everyone else does? With that question in mind, let us begin. Not with kings or wars, but with something far more intimate. The human body, pain, and the strange idea that suffering was once considered necessary. When suffering was considered a virtue. For most of human history, pain was not something to be avoided. It was something to be expected. In many cultures, pain was not even considered a problem. It was considered a tool, a teacher, a purifier, a necessary part of becoming human. Today, we associate pain with failure, a failure of medicine, a failure of protection, a failure of compassion. But for centuries, pain was woven into daily life so tightly that imagining existence without it would have seemed impossible. People did not ask how to eliminate pain. They asked how to endure it. This belief shaped medicine, education, religion, and justice. And because it shaped everything, no one thought to question it. In the world before modern anesthesia, surgery was a spectacle of suffering. Operations were fast, brutal, and terrifying, not because surgeons were cruel, but because speed was mercy. The faster the knife moved, the less time a patient spent screaming. Patients were held down by assistants. Some bit into leather straps, others fainted, many didn't. And when they survived, they were praised for their strength. Pain was seen as proof of character. To endure it was to demonstrate virtue. Doctors believed pain had purpose, that it signaled imbalance leaving the body, that suffering was part of healing. In some cases, pain was thought to make treatment more effective. If a cure hurt, it must be working. This belief extended far beyond surgery. Medical treatments were often intentionally painful. Bloodletting, blistering, burning. The logic was simple. Illness was something to be driven out. Pain was the force that pushed it away. And because patients expected pain, they rarely resisted. They accepted it as the price of survival. Children were taught this early. Pain was one of the primary tools of education. Physical punishment was not controversial. It was instructional. A child who misbehaved was not corrected through explanation. They were corrected through pain. Pain taught obedience. Pain taught respect. Pain taught memory. Parents believed they were preparing children for a harsh world. Teachers believed they were shaping discipline. Society believed pain built character. And character was valued more than comfort. To spare a child pain was considered indulgent, even dangerous. Because a painless upbringing was believed to create weakness. This logic feels alien today. But at the time, it felt responsible. The same belief governed religious life. Pain was associated with purification. Suffering was seen as a path to redemption. To endure pain without complaint was a sign of moral strength. Some believed suffering brought one closer to God. Others believed it cleansed sin. Either way, pain was meaningful. It was not random. It was deserved. This belief made suffering easier to accept, not only one's own, but the suffering of others. Justice systems reflected the same mindset. Punishment was public, pain was visible, and visibility mattered. Punishment was not just about correcting the individual. It was about reminding everyone else. Pain deterred wrongdoing. Fear maintained order. Executions were attended by crowds. Floggings were spectacles. People brought their children, not to traumatize them, but to educate them. This was how society worked. Pain maintained structure. Without it, many believed chaos would follow. What is most disturbing is how little debate surrounded these practices. Pain was not hidden. It was normalized. It appeared in homes, schools, churches, and town squares. It was part of the social fabric. To object would have seemed naive, even suspicious. Why would someone oppose something that had always been done? That question alone kept the system intact. There were, of course, individuals who suffered more than others. The poor, the powerless, the young. But their suffering blended into the background, because suffering itself was common. And when suffering is common, empathy dulls. Over time, pain became invisible, not because it disappeared, but because it was expected. The idea that pain should be minimized did not emerge suddenly. It crept in slowly. As medicine improved, as understanding of the body deepened, as anesthesia was developed, as survival rates increased. Once pain could be removed, people began to question why it had ever been tolerated. But for centuries before that, the question was never asked. Pain was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. This story is uncomfortable because it challenges a comforting assumption that people of the past were simply ignorant. They were not. They were pragmatic. They lived in a world with limited resources, limited knowledge, and constant risk. Pain was everywhere, so they built meaning around it. They moralized it. They institutionalized it, and once pain had meaning, removing it felt wrong, even dangerous. Imagine telling a medieval surgeon that one day people would undergo surgery without feeling anything. They might not have celebrated, they might have worried. If pain disappears, what replaces it? What motivates endurance? What shapes discipline? What teaches consequences? Pain, for better or worse, had become a language, a way society communicated expectations. When that language began to fade, something else had to take its place. Empathy, education, rights. But those concepts required time, and until they arrived, pain remained, accepted, defended, normalized. This is what makes history so unsettling. Cruelty does not always come from hatred. Sometimes it comes from habit, from tradition, from beliefs that go unquestioned for generations. The people who lived through these systems did not see themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as realistic, prepared, strong, and that is what allowed pain to persist for so long. As we move to the next story, the focus narrows further. Because pain was not applied equally. Some bodies were protected, others were not, and among the least protected were those with the least power to object, children. For much of history, childhood itself was not what we think it is today, and the things done to children, openly and without apology, may be some of the most shocking examples of how deeply normal can distort morality. When childhood was not considered innocent today, we see childhood as something precious, a time of protection, of learning, of gradual growth. We assume children are fragile, that they need care, patience, and understanding. But this idea is remarkably new. For most of human history, childhood as we know it did not exist. Children were not seen as innocent. They were seen as unfinished, incomplete adults who needed to be shaped quickly and harshly to survive. In many societies, a child's value was measured not by who they were, but by what they could contribute. Work, obedience, endurance. From a very young age, children were expected to adapt to adult realities. There was little room for softness because softness was dangerous. In a world with high mortality rates, emotional attachment itself was risky. Many children did not survive infancy. Others died young from disease, hunger, or accidents. Grief was common, so common that society learned to manage it by limiting emotional investment. Children were loved, but cautiously. They were replaceable in a way that feels horrifying to us now. This did not mean parents were heartless. It meant survival demanded emotional restraint. When death is frequent, distance becomes protection. As a result, children were often treated as resilient by default. Their pain was minimized, their fear dismissed, their suffering interpreted as necessary. Education reflected this belief. Schools were not designed to nurture curiosity. They were designed to enforce discipline, silence, obedience. Physical punishment was routine. A child who disobeyed was corrected through pain, not out of cruelty, but out of belief. Belief that pain taught faster than words. Belief that fear prevented future mistakes. Belief that children needed to be broken in before adulthood broke them anyway. Many educators believed that sparing a child pain was irresponsible, that it created weakness, and weakness in a harsh world was deadly. Child labor was another accepted reality. Children worked in fields, factories, mines, and workshops, not as an exception, but as a norm. Small bodies were useful. They fit into tight spaces, they required less pay, they asked fewer questions. Society depended on their labor, and because it depended on it, it justified it. Injuries were common. Illness was expected. Exhaustion was routine. But none of this was considered abuse. It was preparation. Preparation for a life that offered no guarantees. Children who could not endure were seen as unfortunate, not wronged. Medical treatment for children followed similar logic. Children were often subjected to experimental procedures, new treatments, unproven methods. Their consent was not sought. Their understanding was irrelevant. Adults decided what was necessary because adults believed they knew better. In orphanages and institutions, this dynamic was even more extreme. Children without parents had no advocates. They were wards of the state, objects of management, ideal subjects for experimentation. They were fed restricted diets to test nutritional theories, given medications to observe reactions, placed in controlled environments to measure behavior. These experiments were not hidden. They were documented, published, praised, because the children involved were seen less as individuals and more as data. Their suffering was abstract, and abstraction makes harm easier to accept. Even within families, children were often treated as property. They belonged to their parents, legally, morally. A parent's authority was rarely questioned. Discipline, however severe, was considered a private matter. Interference was taboo. What happened behind closed doors stayed there. And because this authority was normalized, abuse could hide in plain sight. There was also a widespread belief that children were morally flawed, that they were born wild, uncivilized, in need of correction. This belief justified harsh upbringing. Children were not protected from adult behavior. They witnessed violence, death, punishment, execution. They were expected to absorb these realities without trauma. Because trauma was not recognized. It had no language, no diagnosis. A child who cried too much was weak. A child who resisted was disobedient. Emotional distress was treated as misbehavior, something to be corrected, not understood. The concept of childhood innocence emerged slowly through philosophy, through literature, through changing social conditions. As societies became more stable, the need for constant endurance lessened. As medicine improved, child survival increased. As education shifted, curiosity became valuable. Gradually, children began to be seen not as adults in waiting, but as humans in development. But this shift took centuries, and even then it was uneven. The idea that children deserve protection had to compete with tradition, with economics, with authority. Many resisted it. They argued that softening childhood would weaken society, that comfort would produce dependency, that discipline required pain. These arguments echo throughout history, and they sound disturbingly familiar. What makes this story particularly unsettling is how recently some of these beliefs faded. Child labor persisted into the 20th century. Corporal punishment in schools remained common for generations. Institutional abuse continued behind walls long after society claimed to know better. Change did not come from sudden moral awakening. It came from pressure, from activism, from exposure, from children who grew up and spoke out. The recognition of children as full human beings with rights was not inevitable. It was fought for, and it remains fragile. This story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Society protects what it values, and for a long time children were valued for what they could endure, not for who they were. The suffering of children was not invisible. It was visible and accepted, because acceptance is what defines normal. And once something is normal, resisting it requires courage most people do not have. As we move forward, the focus shifts again, because children were not the only ones whose suffering was normalized. There were entire practices that today feel absurd, even laughable. Yet at the time they were taken seriously. Practices rooted in belief, tradition, and misplaced confidence, especially in medicine. The next story explores those beliefs. The treatments that promised healing, but delivered harm, and the strange logic that made them feel reasonable. When medicine was built on belief, not evidence. When we think of medicine today, we think of precision, clinical trials, data, controlled studies. We trust that treatments exist because they work, but for most of history, medicine was not built on evidence. It was built on belief. Doctors were respected not because their methods were proven, but because they were traditional. Authority mattered more than results. And because disease was poorly understood, almost anything could be justified as treatment. Many of the practices we now view as absurd were once considered cutting edge, not fringe ideas, mainstream medicine, endorsed by experts, practiced confidently. One of the most common treatments in history was bloodletting. For centuries, doctors believed illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. If someone was sick, something was out of balance. And if something was out of balance, it had to be removed. So blood was drained, sometimes a little, sometimes a lot. Patients weakened, some fainted, some died, but bloodletting continued, because when patients survived, the treatment was credited, and when they didn't, the illness was blamed. Failure was never the method's fault, it was the body's. This logic protected bad medicine from criticism. Another popular treatment involved poisons. Small doses of toxic substances were believed to stimulate healing. Mercury was used widely, so was arsenic. Patients were given compounds that today are recognized as lethal. At the time, side effects were seen as proof of effectiveness. If the treatment caused pain, nausea, or weakness, it meant something was happening. The body was reacting. Reaction was mistaken for progress. Doctors expected suffering. Patients accepted it. Healing was not supposed to be comfortable. In fact, comfort was suspicious. A treatment that didn't hurt might not be doing anything at all. Children were subjected to these treatments as well. Their smaller bodies made them more vulnerable, but vulnerability was rarely considered. Medicine was one size fits all. Adults and children were treated the same. And when children suffered, It was seen as unfortunate but unavoidable. The belief system mattered more than the outcome. Some medical practices were rooted in superstition. Astrology influenced diagnosis. Doctors consulted stars to determine treatment. The position of planets was thought to affect health. Timing mattered more than dosage. An illness treated on the wrong day could worsen. On the right day, it might heal. These ideas coexisted with early anatomy. Science and superstition were not separate. They were intertwined. Even as knowledge improved, tradition held power. Another widespread practice was the use of extreme remedies: burning, blistering, cauterization. The idea was to shock the body into recovery. Pain was therapeutic. It forced the body to respond. In some cases, burns were applied near wounds to prevent infection. The pain was immense, the effectiveness questionable. But the logic felt sound at the time. Aggressive disease required aggressive treatment. Mental health treatments were even stranger. Conditions like depression, anxiety, or psychosis were poorly understood. Patients were subjected to isolation, restraint, cold baths, shock. The goal was not comfort, it was control. A calm patient was considered cured, regardless of how that calm was achieved. Some treatments aimed to scare illness away. Patients were frightened intentionally. Exposed to stress, startled, shocked. The belief was that fear could reset the mind. In rare cases, symptoms appeared to lessen. In many others, trauma replaced illness, but trauma was not recognized as harm. It was invisible. So it did not count. What makes these practices especially unsettling is how confident practitioners were. They wrote books. They taught students. They defended their methods publicly. Dissent existed, but it was rare. Questioning medical authority was dangerous. Doctors were among the most trusted figures in society. To challenge them was to challenge order itself. Patients often felt gratitude, even when harmed. They believed suffering was part of healing, that survival required sacrifice, that doctors knew best. This trust made medicine powerful and dangerous, because power without accountability persists. Change came slowly, through observation, through failure, through the accumulation of bodies. As patterns emerged, some doctors began to question tradition. They noticed that some treatments caused more harm than good, that some patients recovered despite treatment, not because of it. But abandoning tradition was difficult. It required admitting generations had been wrong, that suffering had been unnecessary, that authority had misled. These admissions threatened the foundation of medicine itself. So resistance was strong. Even as evidence mounted, belief held firm. It took centuries for evidence-based medicine to replace tradition-based medicine. And even then, the transition was incomplete. Old practices lingered, new ones borrowed their logic. The idea that more intervention is better than less, that aggressive treatment is superior to patience, that action is preferable to restraint. These ideas persist even today. The history of medicine teaches us something uncomfortable. Good intentions are not enough. Belief is not proof, and tradition can be dangerous when it resists correction. The strangest medical practices were not strange because people were foolish. They were strange because people were confident. Confident that they understood the body. Confident that suffering had purpose. Confident that questioning authority was unnecessary. Medicine, like all systems, reflects the values of its time. When pain is normalized, treatments cause pain. When authority is unquestioned, errors persist. When outcomes are secondary to belief, harm becomes routine. As we move forward, the focus widens again. Because these medical practices existed in a world where death was common, where survival was uncertain, and where loss was woven into everyday life. In that world, people developed a relationship with death that feels alien to us today. One where death was not hidden, not delayed, not sanitized, but accepted. The next story explores that relationship and how living so close to death reshaped what society considered normal. When death was an ordinary companion, today death is hidden. It happens in hospitals, behind closed doors, handled by professionals. We soften the language. We avoid the imagery. We distance ourselves from the moment itself. But for most of history, death was not distant. It was immediate, visible, and constant. People did not encounter death once or twice in a lifetime. They lived with it. They planned around it. They expected it. In many historical societies, death was not a disruption of life. It was a feature of it. Infant mortality was high. Childhood survival was uncertain. Disease spread quickly. Medical intervention was limited. A single illness could wipe out entire families. Because of this, people developed a very different relationship with death. Not because they felt less, but because feeling constantly would have been unbearable. Grief was frequent, so it was compressed, shortened, contained. Mourning rituals existed, but life moved on quickly. It had to. The living could not afford to stop. Children grew up surrounded by death. They saw siblings die. They saw parents die. They saw neighbors buried regularly. Funerals were common social events, not solemn exceptions. Children were present. They were not shielded. Death was not considered inappropriate for them. It was considered educational. This exposure shaped perception. Death became familiar. And familiarity dulls fear. People did not romanticize death, but they did not panic at its presence. It was understood as inevitable, and inevitability breeds acceptance. The dead were not hidden from view. Bodies were displayed in homes, prepared by family members, mourned publicly. The physical reality of death was unavoidable. Smell, decay, stillness. These were not shocking. They were known. Cemeteries were central to towns, often located near churches, markets, or gathering places. People passed graves daily. They walked over bones. Children played near burial grounds. Death was woven into the geography of life. Even punishment involved death openly. Executions were public. Crowds gathered, not out of cruelty alone, but out of normalization. Seeing death was part of civic life. It reinforced order, reminded people of consequences, and because it was public, it became routine. The condemned were not abstract figures. They were visible, human. And yet, the crowd watched. Sometimes quietly, sometimes with excitement. Death, when repeated, loses its shock. It becomes spectacle. Even disease outbreaks were met with resignation. Plagues devastated cities. People fled if they could, but many stayed. There was no illusion of control. When death came, it came. And once that truth was accepted, fear transformed into endurance. Religious belief played a major role in shaping this attitude. Death was not the end. It was a transition, a passage. Life on earth was temporary. What mattered was what came after. This belief softened the blow. It gave death meaning. Suffering could be tolerated if it led somewhere else. Heaven, redemption, peace. Without this belief, constant death might have shattered society. With it, death became survivable psychologically. But this acceptance had a cost. When death is normal, prevention feels less urgent. If children die often, society adapts. If illness kills regularly, it becomes fate. People focus on endurance, not intervention. This slowed the development of protective systems. Public health, safety regulations, preventive medicine. Why invest in prevention if death is inevitable? Why fight what feels natural? This mindset shaped priorities. People prepared spiritually more than physically. They wrote wills early. expected loss. Life was fragile, and fragility shaped behavior. Families had many children, knowing some would not survive. Emotional attachment was tempered by realism. Love existed, but it was guarded. This does not mean people cared less. It means they learned to live with loss. And living with loss changes perspective. One of the most unsettling aspects of this history is how calmly people spoke about death. Letters mention deaths casually. Records list children who died without elaboration. Entire lives reduced to a line, not because they were insignificant, but because death was frequent, and frequency breeds brevity. Over time, death became background noise, not ignored, but integrated. This integration allowed societies to function, but it also allowed suffering to persist unchallenged. The idea that death could be delayed, prevented, reduced, that idea emerged slowly, as medicine improved, as sanitation advanced, as life expectancy increased. Only when death became less common did it become shocking. Only when survival became expected did death feel unjust. This shift fundamentally changed morality. A child's death was no longer fate. It was failure. A disease outbreak was no longer divine will. It was a problem to solve. This transformation reshaped society. Death moved from the center to the margins, out of homes into institutions handled by professionals managed discreetly. Modern society treats death as an interruption, a tragedy, something to be avoided, but this perspective is new and it rests on centuries of change. Understanding how normal death once was forces us to confront something uncomfortable. Our horror at historical suffering comes from our distance from it. Distance created by progress, distance created by stability, distance created by safety. People of the past were not numb. They were adapted. They lived in conditions that demanded acceptance. Judging them without understanding those conditions misses the point. The normalization of death shaped everything else: pain, childhood, medicine, violence. When death is everywhere, the value of life is understood differently, not diminished, but contextualized. Life was precious because it was fragile, but fragility also meant it could be lost without stopping the world. As we move forward, the focus shifts again, because when death becomes normal, violence often follows. And in many societies, violence itself became entertainment, public, organized, accepted. The next story explores that uncomfortable truth. How human suffering, displayed openly, became something people gathered to watch. Not because they were cruel, but because cruelty had become familiar. When suffering became a public spectacle today, violence is something we claim to reject. We hide it behind screens, we censor it, we frame it as fiction, and when it happens in real life, we describe it as shocking, unacceptable. But for much of history, violence was not hidden. It was advertised, it was organized, and most disturbingly, it was enjoyed. Human suffering was not only tolerated, it was a form of entertainment. In many societies, public punishment was not about justice alone. It was about participation. Executions were scheduled events. They were announced in advance. Crowds gathered early. People brought food. They brought children, not to traumatize them, but because this was considered a normal civic experience. Watching someone suffer was not seen as cruelty. It was seen as instruction. Pain taught lessons. Fear reinforced order, and spectacle made those lessons unforgettable. In ancient arenas, violence reached theatrical levels. Gladiatorial games were not secret acts of brutality. They were celebrated festivals. People cheered. They placed bets. They admired strength and endurance. Death was part of the show. not an accident. The fighters were human beings, but in the moment they were symbols of honor, of punishment, of entertainment. The audience did not see individuals with families and fears. They saw roles being played, and roles are easier to destroy than people. This pattern repeated across centuries. In medieval towns, executions were social gatherings. Hanging, beheading, burning. Each method carried meaning. The executioner was a public figure. The condemned were displayed. Their final moments were meant to be seen. Crowds reacted. Some prayed, some mocked, some cheered. The emotional response varied. But indifference was rare. Violence drew attention. It created shared experience. This is one of the most unsettling truths about human nature. Violence, when normalized, becomes communal. It binds people together, not because they enjoy suffering itself, but because shared emotion creates connection. Public violence was one of the few moments when entire communities gathered. In an era without mass entertainment, it filled a void. It was dramatic, unpredictable, emotionally charged, and because it was framed as justice, it felt justified. The state sanctioned it, religion endorsed it, authority legitimized it. That legitimacy mattered. It told people they were not doing something wrong. They were participating in order. This framing protected the conscience. If violence serves justice, then witnessing it is not immoral. It is responsible. Children grew up watching these events. They absorbed the message early. This is what happens to those who break rule. This is how society protects itself. Fear was not a side effect, it was the goal, and fear works best when it is visible. Over time, repetition dulled sensitivity. The first execution might shock. The 10th becomes routine. The 100th becomes expected. When violence is frequent, it loses emotional weight. People adapt, they laugh, they talk, they watch. What once felt horrifying becomes background noise. This desensitization allowed violence to escalate. Punishments became harsher, methods more theatrical, because spectacle required escalation. A crowd that has seen it all demands something new, something more intense. This cycle mirrors modern entertainment in uncomfortable ways, but in the past, the suffering was real, the bodies were real, the death was final. Another form of public violence involved humiliation. People were placed in stocks, paraded through streets, mocked, pelted with objects. This was not about pain alone. It was about social control, public shame, enforced conformity. The crowd participated actively. They laughed, they insulted, they felt power. For a moment, ordinary people became judges. This participation mattered. It transformed punishment into collective action. Responsibility was shared. No single person felt cruel. Everyone was just part of the crowd. This diffusion of responsibility made cruelty easier. The system did not rely on sadism. It relied on normalization. Violence was embedded in culture, in law, in religion, in entertainment. To object was to question authority, and questioning authority carried risks, so most people did not object. They attended, they watched, they accepted. The idea that violence should be hidden is a modern development. It emerged as societies changed, as centralized states replaced public punishment with private incarceration, as empathy expanded, as the spectacle of suffering became uncomfortable rather than instructive. But this shift did not happen because people suddenly became kinder. It happened because violence lost its usefulness. Public punishment stopped deterring crime. Crowds sympathized with the condemned. Executions sometimes sparked unrest. The spectacle became unpredictable, dangerous. So violence was removed from public view. Prisons replaced scaffolds, cells replaced crowds, suffering continued, but it became invisible. This invisibility allowed society to claim moral progress. We no longer watch people die, we say. But suffering did not disappear. It changed location, and perhaps meaning. Looking back, it is tempting to judge the past harshly, to ask how people could watch such things. But the answer is uncomfortable. They watched because it was normal, because it was endorsed, because it was familiar. And familiarity dulls outrage. The people in those crowds were not uniquely cruel. They were conditioned, just as we are conditioned by our own norms. This story forces us to confront a difficult idea. Violence does not need hatred to survive. It needs acceptance, and acceptance often comes disguised as tradition. Justice. Entertainment. The line between them was thin and often invisible. As societies evolved, violence moved from center stage to the margins, but its legacy remained. In the way we tell stories, in the way we frame punishment, in the way we distance ourselves from harm. Understanding how violence once entertained forces us to ask a hard question. What do we watch today without flinching that future generations will find impossible to understand? What suffering feels distant enough to be acceptable? Because history shows us this. When suffering becomes spectacle, empathy is the first casualty. As we move forward, the focus shifts again, from crowds to individuals, from public squares to workplaces, because while violence entertained the masses, danger was quietly accepted elsewhere, in the jobs people did every day. Jobs so dangerous that today they would be unthinkable. And yet, once they were simply how people earned a living. When danger was simply part of the job. Today, danger at work is considered unacceptable. We talk about safety standards, protective equipment, regulations. When someone is injured on the job, we call it a failure, an accident that should not have happened. But for most of history, danger was not a failure of work. It was the nature of it. People did not expect to return home safely. They hoped to, and hope was enough. Entire professions were built on risk so extreme that, by modern standards, they feel almost unreal. Yet at the time, they were normal, necessary, unremarkable. Industrialization did not create dangerous work. It intensified it. As cities grew and industries expanded, the demand for labor exploded. Mines went deeper. Machines grew larger. Production accelerated. Safety did not. Workers entered environments filled with toxic air, crushing weight, and constant mechanical threat. They knew the risks, but they had little choice. A job, even a deadly one, was better than starvation. Miners descended into shafts with weak supports and poor ventilation. Explosions were common, cave-ins frequent, black lung disease slowly destroyed their lungs. Many never reached old age. This was expected. A miner who lived long enough to retire was considered fortunate, not wronged. Factories presented a different kind of danger. Machines with exposed gears and blades operated without safeguards. Workers, including children, stood inches away from moving parts. A moment of distraction could cost a limb, or a life. Injuries were so common that they barely registered. Factories kept spare workers because loss was anticipated. Human bodies were replaceable components in a larger system. Chemical exposure was another silent threat. People worked with substances they did not understand. Mercury, lead, arsenic. They handled them daily, inhaled fumes, absorbed toxins through skin. Symptoms appeared gradually: headaches, tremors, madness, death. But because effects were delayed, the connection to work was often denied. Workers were blamed for weakness, not warned of danger. Some professions were dangerous in ways that felt almost absurd. Chimney sweeps, often children, climbed inside narrow flues coated with soot. They suffocated, they fell, they developed cancers, but their small size made them useful, and usefulness outweighed concern. In agriculture, danger was seasonal but relentless. Harvest machinery crushed limbs, animals injured handlers, exposure to weather caused illness. Yet farming was romanticized, seen as honest labor. Its risks were normalized. Even professions associated with public service were perilous. Early firefighters lacked protective gear. They rushed into burning buildings with minimal equipment. Many died, but heroism masked danger. Loss was framed as noble, acceptable. In maritime work, sailors faced storms, disease, and shipwreck. Ships vanished without explanation. Families waited without closure. Death at sea was common, expected, and rarely investigated. What unites these professions is not recklessness, it is acceptance. Society accepted that some jobs would destroy bodies, and because these jobs were essential, the cost was justified. Danger was priced into wages, low wages, because there were always others willing to take the risk, often because they had no alternative. This acceptance shaped how employers behaved. If injury was expected, prevention felt unnecessary. Why invest in safety when replacement was cheap? This logic was rarely spoken aloud, but it governed decisions. Workers who complained were seen as troublesome, weak, unreliable. They could be replaced. The idea of workers' rights did not emerge naturally. It was forced into existence. Through protest, through strikes, through bodies. The deaths of workers were the evidence that arguments required. But before that shift, danger remained invisible, because it was spread out. One injury here, one death there. Not enough at once to demand attention. Another unsettling aspect of these jobs was how early people started. Children entered dangerous work environments young. Not because parents wanted them harmed, but because families needed income. Children worked long hours, handled tools meant for adults. They were injured, killed. But these losses were absorbed into family history, not national conscience. When danger is common, it loses its ability to shock. People adapt. They develop rituals, superstitions, beliefs meant to impose meaning on risk, luck charms, prayers, rules passed down informally. These rituals did not reduce danger. They made it psychologically manageable. And management mattered more than prevention. As long as people could endure fear, work continued. The transformation began slowly, with data, with statistics, with the realization that many injuries were not accidents. They were predictable, preventable. As patterns emerged, the idea of safety gained legitimacy. Protective equipment was introduced, regulations proposed. Employers resisted. Safety slowed production, cost money, acknowledged responsibility. Change did not come easily. It was resisted as unrealistic, as indulgent, as harmful to business. The same arguments appeared again and again. Safety would destroy jobs, regulation would weaken industry, risk was unavoidable. And to some extent, that was true. Work will always involve risk, but the degree of risk is a choice, and for a long time that choice favored profit over people. The normalization of dangerous work teaches us something important. Society tolerates suffering when it is distributed, when no single event is dramatic enough to demand change, when victims are anonymous, and when danger feels unavoidable. Only when suffering becomes concentrated does it provoke action, a disaster, a collapse, an explosion. Suddenly, what was normal becomes unacceptable. History is full of such moments, moments when the cost of normalcy became too visible to ignore. But even then, change was partial. Many dangerous jobs remain. Many risks persist. The difference is visibility. We now name danger. We measure it. We regulate it. But regulation exists because danger once felt natural. Understanding this history reminds us that progress is reactive, not proactive. It responds to harm. It does not anticipate it, which raises another uncomfortable question. What dangers do we currently accept because they feel necessary? Because they are hidden? Because they are someone else's job? History suggests that acceptance is not morality. It is convenience, and convenience often masks harm. As we move forward, the focus shifts again, from physical danger to something less visible, the danger of knowledge without consent. Because while bodies were sacrificed for labor, minds were sacrificed for progress, in the name of science. The next story explores a time when experimentation on human beings was not hidden, not controversial, but accepted and often praised. When progress was placed above consent, today we expect science to be careful. Ethical review boards, informed consent, strict boundaries. We assume these safeguards have always existed. They have not. For much of history, science operated under a different assumption, that knowledge itself was a moral good, and that anything which advanced understanding was justified, even if it harmed people, especially if those people were considered expendable. The idea that individuals should consent to experimentation is surprisingly recent. For centuries, consent was irrelevant. Authority decided, science advanced, subjects endured. In early medical research, the human body was seen as a tool, a means to an end, an object to be studied, altered, tested. The suffering of the individual was secondary to the benefit of knowledge. And because knowledge promised to help many, harm to a few was accepted. This logic felt reasonable at the time. Doctors believed they were serving humanity. Governments believed they were serving progress. Institutions believed they were building a better future. And because intentions were framed as noble, scrutiny was minimal. Many experiments were conducted on those with little power. Prisoners, the poor, the mentally ill, orphans, people who could not refuse or whose refusal carried consequences. These populations were accessible, controlled, invisible to the broader public. That invisibility mattered. Experiments were easier to justify when their subjects were unseen. In institutions, patients were subjected to treatments designed more to observe than to heal. Diets were restricted to test nutritional theories. Exposure to extreme conditions measured endurance. Psychological stress was induced deliberately. Fear, isolation, humiliation. These were tools, not side effects. The results were recorded meticulously. Graphs, charts, reports, but the human cost was rarely discussed because data mattered more than experience. Another unsettling aspect of these experiments is how normal they seemed to participants. Subjects often trusted authority. They believed doctors knew best. They assumed suffering was necessary. They did not question procedures because questioning was not encouraged. Obedience was expected. In many cases, subjects were not told the full truth. They were given partial explanations, or none at all. Deception was common. It was seen as a scientific necessity. If subjects knew what was being tested, the results might be compromised, so they were kept in the dark. This deception caused harm beyond physical pain. It eroded trust. But trust was not a concern. Results were. Psychological experiments were particularly invasive. Researchers explored obedience, conformity, fear. They pushed individuals to act against their own morals, to obey harmful instructions, to endure stress far beyond comfort. When subjects broke down, it was noted, analyzed, sometimes praised as valuable insight. The emotional aftermath was ignored. Long-term consequences were rarely tracked. Once the experiment ended, responsibility ended. What is most disturbing is how these practices were often celebrated. published in respected journals, taught in universities, cited as breakthroughs. The suffering of subjects became footnotes, necessary sacrifices for understanding human nature. This celebration reinforced the system. Success justified harm, and because success was defined by publication, not well-being, the cycle continued. Some researchers genuinely believed they were helping, that future generations would benefit, that suffering now would prevent suffering later. This belief allowed them to detach emotionally, to see subjects as variables, not people. Detachment is dangerous. It allows harm to be rationalized, and rationalization is how ethical lines fade. Over time, scandals exposed the cost of unchecked experimentation. Survivors spoke out. Journalists investigated. Public trust wavered. The gap between scientific authority and human rights became visible. It was only then that ethics began to formalize. Rules were written. Consent became mandatory. Oversight was established. But even these changes were reactive. They followed harm. They did not prevent it. And even now, ethical debates persist because the tension remains. Progress demands risk, but risk demands limits. The history of human experimentation teaches us a difficult lesson. Science is not inherently moral. It reflects the values of those who practice it. When society values progress above individuals, science follows. When authority is trusted blindly, harm becomes possible. The normalization of experimentation without consent did not require evil. It required confidence. Confidence that the goal justified the means. Confidence that future benefit erased present pain. Confidence that some lives could be used for the greater good. That confidence was rarely questioned, until the consequences became impossible to ignore. This story forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Ethics are not automatic. They are constructed, negotiated, and enforced. Without enforcement, good intentions are not enough. The same logic that once justified experimentation still exists in new forms. In debates about data, privacy, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, the subjects may change. But the question remains the same. Who bears the cost of progress and who decides? As we move forward, the focus shifts again, from science to society. Because experimentation was not the only area where inequality was normalized. Entire systems of discrimination were once seen as logical, natural, even beneficial. The next story explores how prejudice was not hidden or challenged, but openly accepted, protected by law, and defended by belief. When inequality was considered common sense. Today, discrimination is something most societies claim to reject. We frame it as ignorance, as hatred, as a moral failure. We assume it survives only in the shadows, but for most of history, discrimination was not hidden. It was visible, organized, and openly defended. Inequality was not seen as injustice. It was seen as order. People did not ask whether society was fair. They asked whether everyone knew their place. Hierarchy was considered natural, inevitable, even necessary. Some people were believed to be born to rule, others to serve, others to endure. This belief shaped law, religion, science, and culture. And because it shaped everything, it rarely felt cruel. It felt logical. In many societies, social class determined a person's entire life. Where they lived, what they wore, who they could marry, what work they could do. Movement between classes was rare, not discouraged, impossible. This rigidity was not viewed as oppression. It was stability, a predictable system that reduced conflict. People accepted inequality because challenging it threatened chaos. Gender roles were equally rigid. Women were excluded from education, politics, and ownership. Not because they were seen as capable, but denied. They were seen as inherently different, emotionally weaker, intellectually inferior, better suited to obedience. These ideas were taught as fact, supported by selective interpretation of religion, reinforced by custom. A woman who questioned her role was not seen as progressive. She was seen as unnatural, dangerous. In many cases, women were legally treated as dependents, their rights transferred from father to husband. Autonomy was not expected, and because it was not expected, its absence was not mourned. The suffering this caused was invisible, because it was normal. Racial discrimination followed similar logic. Certain groups were labeled inferior based on appearance, origin, or culture. This labeling justified exploitation, enslavement, segregation, violence. Science was often used to legitimize these beliefs. Measurements of skulls, theories of hierarchy, pseudoscientific claims presented as objective truth. These ideas were not fringe. They were mainstream, taught in universities, published in respected journals. They gave prejudice the appearance of reason, and reason is powerful. It transforms bias into policy. Once discrimination is written into law, it becomes self-sustaining. People follow rules. Rules shape behavior. Behavior reinforces belief. Soon inequality feels normal, even moral. Those who benefit rarely question it. Those who suffer have little power to resist, and because the system appears stable, many defend it. Not out of hatred, but out of fear. Fear that change would disrupt order. Fear that equality would threaten status. Fear that questioning hierarchy would unravel society. This fear kept discrimination intact for centuries. Another disturbing aspect is how ordinary people participated. Shopkeepers refused service. Teachers enforced separation. Neighbors reported violations. Not because they were forced, but because they believed it was right. Discrimination did not require constant violence. It required participation, small acts, daily decisions. This made it harder to see as cruelty. It was simply how things were done. Children learned these distinctions early: who to respect, who to avoid, who mattered. These lessons were not whispered. They were taught openly, in schools, in churches, in families. Once learned, they felt natural, and natural things rarely feel wrong. Even when discrimination caused visible harm, it was rationalized. Poverty was blamed on laziness, exclusion on incapacity, violence on provocation. The system always found ways to justify itself. Victims were blamed for their own suffering. This protected the conscience of the majority. Progress against discrimination did not begin with sudden enlightenment. It began with disruption, economic shifts, wars, social movements. Moments when old hierarchies failed to deliver stability. Only then did people question whether inequality truly served society. And even then, resistance was fierce. Those who challenged discrimination were labeled radicals, troublemakers, threats to order. The argument was always the same. Equality is unnatural. Equality will cause chaos. Equality will destroy tradition. These arguments echo across history. They appear whenever power is questioned. What makes this story particularly uncomfortable is how recent many of these beliefs are. Legal discrimination persisted well into the modern era. Segregation, gender exclusion, institutional bias. These were not ancient relics, they were living systems, and some still are. The shift from acceptance to condemnation did not erase the past, it layered over it. Traces remain, in language, in assumptions, in structures that outlast the beliefs that created them. Understanding how discrimination was once normal forces us to confront an unsettling possibility. Morality is not fixed. It moves with culture, with power, with necessity. People rarely wake up and decide to be unjust. They inherit systems, they follow rules, they accept explanations, and acceptance repeated enough times becomes belief. As we move forward, the focus shifts again. Because discrimination was often supported by beliefs that went beyond social structure. Beliefs about reality itself, about the unseen, about cause and effect. Ideas that today feel irrational, but once guided entire civilizations. The next story explores those beliefs, the strange ideas that were widely accepted, not as superstition, but as truth. When belief replaced evidence. Every society is built on belief. Not all belief is religious. Some beliefs are practical, others are cultural, and some are simply inherited ideas that feel true because everyone around us accepts them. For most of history, belief filled the gaps where knowledge did not exist, and those gaps were vast. People needed explanations for illness, for disaster, for behavior, for suffering. When science could not answer, belief stepped in, and once belief offered certainty, it became powerful. Some beliefs now seem harmless, others feel deeply unsettling, but at the time they were normal. Astrology guided decisions that affected entire lives. The movement of planets was believed to influence personality, health, and fate. Doctors consulted star charts before prescribing treatment. Kings delayed battles based on celestial signs. Marriages were approved or denied based on birth dates. This was not fringe mysticism. It was mainstream thought. Astrology offered structure in an unpredictable world. It transformed chaos into pattern, and people clung to it because it made life feel intelligible. Another widespread belief involved illness and morality. Disease was often interpreted as punishment, a sign of moral failure, or spiritual impurity. People believed sickness reflected inner corruption. This belief justified isolation, shame, neglect. The sick were not always treated as victims. They were treated as warnings. Leprosy is a stark example. Those afflicted were cast out, forced to live on the margins, not primarily for public health, but for moral separation. The illness was seen as a sign of divine judgment. Compassion was limited, because punishment was believed to be deserved. Mental illness was even more misunderstood. Conditions we now recognize as depression, anxiety, or psychosis were interpreted as possession. Curses, moral weakness. People believed the mind was a battleground between good and evil. Treatment focused on expelling darkness, not understanding trauma. Exorcisms were common. Restraint was accepted. Isolation was normalized. The suffering of the afflicted was seen as part of the process. If someone resisted treatment, it was taken as proof of guilt. Belief was self-reinforcing. Another deeply rooted belief involved gender and biology. Women were thought to be governed by their bodies, by emotion, by instability. Medical theories claimed that female physiology caused irrational behavior. This belief justified exclusion from education and leadership. It was considered scientific. Doctors published theories about wandering organs and emotional fragility. These ideas were taught as fact, and because they were repeated by authority, they shaped reality. Women internalized them. Men enforced them. Belief created behavior, and behavior reinforced belief. Some beliefs shaped justice. Trials by ordeal were once common. The accused were subjected to physical tests: fire, water, pain. If they survived, they were innocent. If they died, they were guilty. This logic seems absurd now, but at the time it felt fair. It removed human judgment. It placed truth in the hands of a higher power. People trusted the outcome because it felt impartial. But impartiality was an illusion. The ordeal punished the vulnerable, not the guilty. Still, belief sustained it. Even economic beliefs shaped suffering. Poverty was often seen as moral failure. The poor were believed to be lazy, undisciplined, inferior. This belief justified harsh treatment. Workhouses, punitive laws, neglect. If poverty was a personal flaw, society had no obligation to help. Belief transformed inequality into inevitability. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these beliefs is how resistant they were to contradiction. Evidence alone was not enough to dismantle them. Contradictory experiences were explained away. Exceptions were ignored. Belief systems are resilient. They adapt to protect themselves. When a belief becomes central to identity, challenging it feels like an attack. This is why harmful beliefs persist, not because they are convincing, but because they are comforting. They simplify the world, they assign blame, they reduce uncertainty. People fear uncertainty more than error, so they choose belief over doubt. Over time, some beliefs were challenged. Through observation, through contradiction, through catastrophe, plagues exposed the limits of moral explanations. Scientific advances revealed patterns belief could not explain. Gradually, evidence began to replace tradition. But this process was uneven. Some beliefs faded quickly. Others lingered. Some transformed rather than disappeared. They adapted to new language, new frameworks, new justifications. Even today, belief competes with evidence. In health, in politics, in culture, the tension remains. Because belief fulfills emotional needs, evidence does not. It offers meaning, identity, belonging. History teaches us that belief itself is not the problem. The problem is unexamined belief, belief protected by authority, belief immune to challenge, belief used to justify harm. When belief becomes normal, it becomes invisible. People stop noticing its influence. They assume it reflects reality, not interpretation. This is what makes historical beliefs so unsettling, not their content, but their certainty. People did not believe these things weakly, they believed them completely, and complete belief leaves no room for doubt. As we approach the final story, the focus turns inward, because it is tempting to see these beliefs as relics, as mistakes of the past. But history suggests something else. Every era has its own unquestioned beliefs, ideas so accepted that they feel obvious, natural, beyond debate. The final story is not about the past alone. It is about us, about the things we currently accept without hesitation, the practices we defend, the assumptions we inherit. Because if history has taught us anything, it is this. The most dangerous beliefs are not the ones that seem strange. They are the ones that feel normal. What will the future find unbelievable about us? It is easy to look at the past and feel certain that we would have acted differently, certain that we would have questioned injustice, certain that we would have known better. But every generation believes this. Every generation assumes it has reached a clearer moral understanding than the one before, and every generation is partly right and partly blind. The people we have discussed throughout this video did not think of themselves as cruel. They believed they were reasonable, practical, realistic. They lived within systems that rewarded acceptance and punished doubt, and because those systems worked, at least on the surface, questioning them felt unnecessary. This is where history turns its gaze toward us. Because we too live inside systems that feel normal, systems we rarely stop to question, practices we defend as necessary, trade-offs we accept without hesitation. The question is not whether our time has blind spots. It does. The question is which ones we cannot see. Consider how we relate to labor. We condemn dangerous work of the past, and yet many of the goods we rely on are produced under conditions we never witness. Factories far away, workers we will never meet, risks we do not face. The danger is no longer local, it is outsourced. Distance makes acceptance easier. Suffering feels abstract when it is far away. History has shown us this pattern before. When harm is hidden, it becomes tolerable. When victims are invisible, responsibility fades. Consider how we treat mental health. We speak openly about awareness, but many systems still prioritize productivity over well-being. Stress is normalized, burnout is expected, emotional exhaustion is reframed as ambition. Those who struggle are encouraged to adapt, not the system. The language has changed, the logic has not. We accept certain levels of suffering because they are framed as the cost of success. Consider how we treat data. Information about our lives is collected constantly, tracked, stored, analyzed. We trade privacy for convenience, security for speed, and because this trade feels voluntary, it feels acceptable. But future generations may ask why we surrendered so much without fully understanding the consequences, why we trusted systems we could not see, why we assumed progress would remain benevolent. Consider how we treat punishment. We no longer gather in public squares to watch executions, but we incarcerate millions, often out of sight, out of mind. We accept long-term confinement as necessary, even when evidence suggests it does not always reduce harm. The violence has not vanished. It has become bureaucratic, administrative, normalized. History suggests that invisibility is not morality, it is convenience. Consider how we treat technology. We adopt tools faster than we understand them. We allow algorithms to shape behavior, attention, belief. We accept constant surveillance as the price of participation, and we reassure ourselves that we have nothing to hide. This is a familiar argument, one history has heard many times. Those who benefit from systems rarely feel threatened by them, until they do. Consider how we treat the environment. We know the consequences, we have data, models, predictions, and yet action is slow. Delay feels rational. Sacrifice feels inconvenient. We normalize gradual harm because it does not demand immediate response. History shows us that slow damage is easier to ignore than sudden catastrophe, until it is too late. None of this means our time is uniquely cruel, it means it is human. Every era balances comfort against conscience, convenience against cost, stability against change. The past did not fail because people lacked intelligence. It failed because people prioritized what felt necessary in the moment, and necessity is always defined by context. This is why judging the past without reflection is misleading. The same forces that shaped historical normalcy shape ours: authority, habit, fear, economic pressure, social expectation. We do not wake up each day and choose injustice. We inherit it, we adapt to it, we defend it, often unintentionally, often sincerely, often believing we are doing what is reasonable. History teaches us that the most harmful practices rarely begin as acts of malice. They begin as solutions to problems that feel urgent, solutions that offer stability, solutions that work just well enough to be defended. Over time, those solutions harden into systems, and systems resist change, not because they are evil, but because they are familiar. This is why progress is always uncomfortable. It requires admitting that what once felt normal caused harm. It requires mourning a past self, a collective self, that believed things which later proved wrong. This admission is painful. It challenges identity. It disrupts continuity. And so it is resisted, until resistance becomes more costly than change. Looking forward, future generations will judge us, not out of cruelty, but out of distance. They will see patterns we cannot. They will ask questions we did not think to ask. They will be shocked not by our technology, but by our tolerance, by the things we accepted as unavoidable, by the harm we rationalized as necessary. This is not an accusation. It is a reminder. Normal is not a moral category. It is a social one, and social categories shift. What feels ordinary today may feel indefensible tomorrow. The value of studying history is not to condemn those who lived before us. It is to recognize how easily morality bends under pressure. and how important it is to remain uncomfortable with certainty. History does not demand perfection. It demands awareness, the willingness to question what feels obvious, to examine what feels necessary, to ask who benefits and who pays the price. The past shows us that progress happens not when people become better, but when systems become impossible to defend, when suffering becomes visible, when silence breaks. This means that change is not guaranteed. It must be chosen, again and again, in small ways, in inconvenient ways, often against instinct. The most unsettling lesson of history is not that people once accepted terrible things. It is that acceptance felt reasonable at the time, and that is what should concern us most. Because reason without reflection can justify almost anything. As we reach the end of this journey, one truth becomes clear. History was not strange because people were different. It was strange because normal is fragile, temporary, and deeply dependent on context. Understanding this does not make us cynical. It makes us careful. It reminds us that the present will one day be the past, and that how we live now will be judged not by our intentions, but by our impact. The question history leaves us with is not simple, and it has no final answer. But it is worth asking. What in our time feels so normal that we no longer notice it? And what would it take for us to question it? As we reach the end of this journey, it may feel tempting to close the book on the past, to label it cruel, backward, uninformed, and then to move on. But history does not ask us to move on so easily, because history is not something that stays behind us. It travels with us, quietly, embedded in habits, systems, and assumptions we rarely question. The strange things we explored in this video were not strange to the people who lived with them. They were ordinary, they were familiar, they were accepted. That is what made them powerful, and that is what made them dangerous. When something is normal, it does not feel like a choice. It feels like reality. People do not wake up intending to harm others. They wake up intending to live within the world as it is presented to them. And when the world presents cruelty as routine, cruelty becomes invisible. History reminds us that morality does not arrive fully formed. It is negotiated, revised, often painfully. What one era defends, another condemns. What one generation accepts, another apologizes for. This is not because humanity constantly fails. It is because humanity constantly adapts, sometimes too slowly. The people of the past were not villains in a story we have outgrown. They were participants in systems that rewarded conformity and punished doubt. Just as we are. They followed rules, trusted authority, accepted explanations, and in doing so, they sustained practices that future generations would struggle to understand. This does not mean progress is an illusion. It means progress is fragile, dependent on visibility, on voices willing to question what feels settled, on people willing to be uncomfortable, because comfort is the enemy of reflection. When life feels stable, questioning feels unnecessary. When systems work for us, their cost to others fades from view. History shows us that the most harmful practices rarely collapse under moral argument alone. They collapse when enough people refuse to accept them as normal. When silence becomes heavier than resistance. When the cost of maintaining a system outweighs the cost of changing it. This is why studying history matters. Not to assign blame, but to sharpen awareness, to remind us that our confidence today may look like blindness tomorrow, that the things we defend as necessary may one day be seen as excuses, that the systems we rely on may leave traces we do not intend. History does not demand that we judge the past harshly. It asks something more difficult, that we judge ourselves honestly. It asks us to notice patterns, to recognize how authority shapes belief, how habit dulls empathy, how distance makes suffering tolerable, and how easily good intentions align with harmful outcomes. The unsettling truth is this. Every generation believes it has reached a moral threshold, that it has learned enough from the past to avoid repeating it. And every generation is wrong in some way, not because people do not care, but because caring is shaped by context, and context limits vision. This does not mean we are doomed to repeat history. It means vigilance matters more than certainty. Progress depends not on believing we are better, but on remaining aware that we might not be, that there are things we accept today simply because they are familiar, because they are legal, because they are profitable, because they are distant, because questioning them would require sacrifice. History suggests that those are precisely the things worth examining. The past is not a warning about monsters. It is a mirror held up to ordinary people, people who loved their families, worked hard, believed they were doing what was right, and still participated in systems that caused harm. This is what makes history uncomfortable. It refuses to separate evil from normalcy. It shows us that they often coexist. If there is one lesson to carry forward, it is this. Normal is not a moral standard, it is a temporary agreement, an arrangement shaped by power, belief, and necessity, and like all agreements, it can be renegotiated, but only if people notice it exists, only if people ask who it serves, and only if people are willing to imagine something different. The future will judge us. Not with anger, but with curiosity. They will look at our lives and ask questions we did not think to ask. They will wonder how certain things were tolerated, how others were ignored, how some harms were justified as unavoidable. And they will do so not because they are wiser, but because they are distant, just as we are distant from the past. Understanding this does not diminish progress. It deepens it. It reminds us that awareness is not a destination, it is a practice, one that must be renewed constantly. As this video ends, there is no call to action, no simple conclusion, no reassurance that we have learned enough. There is only a question, one that history leaves us with again and again. What in our lives feels so normal that we no longer see it? And what might future generations struggle to understand about us? Sitting with that question may be uncomfortable, but discomfort has always been the beginning of change. And unlike the pain once normalized by history, this discomfort serves a purpose. It keeps us awake.